This thing is like magic. It allows me to take my photographs, like this one, and turn my photograph into a monotype. Hi, I'm Jessica Russo Scherr, and I've been experimenting with all things gel plate monotypes. And the main things I work on are image transfers. In this video, I'm going to take you through step by step some of my more recent gel plate monotypes and some of the more experimental techniques that I've been using and some of the more traditional techniques that I've been using. So I hope you enjoy this, and let me know in the comments if you have any questions or anything you want me to cover in a future video. Also, before we begin, let's talk about supplies. Now, I use a range of supplies. Not all of them are 100% necessary. I have the list of most of my things here, and you can find my specific ones that I like on my Amazon storefront. That link is in the description below. Let me start off by taking you through how I edit my photos. You have to start off with a good quality image and go to image size and change the resolution. Of course, this is in Photoshop. You can use other apps. Make sure resample is not selected. I'm just showing the way I do it in Photoshop, but other apps can work equally well. Then I want to make sure I have a good amount of contrast to it, and it helps to make it into black and white first. There's lots of ways you could adjust it into black and white, and then I like to use levels usually first, and sometimes I'll tweak around with a few other options. Adjust the highlights, bring them up, bring the darks a little bit further up, and then see how the image looks. After that, I can go to image mode and grayscale. Switch it into grayscale, which is the necessary step to go to image mode bitmap. This will change it into halftone. I'm using these settings. They usually work pretty well, but you can play around with what works for you. And there are a few different options that you can experiment with to try for different looks for your halftone. This creates those little tiny dots, which helps with gradients and transitions into gray areas. So you can play around with these features here or go back, and this is what it would look like with a different halftone. So not too much difference, but a bit of difference. So all in all, that's what I do. I also then have to change it back into CMYK. And in order to do that, you have to do this weird step where you have to go through grayscale, click OK, and then go back to CMYK. And that's how I edit my photos almost uniformly. It varies a little bit photo to photo. So I hope this helps, and now we can get to transferring. Let's start off with the image transfer. I made a few mistakes. I didn't have enough acrylic paint on the plate. So instead of tossing it out and just being like, this is not going to work, I used additive and subtractive printmaking techniques to help improve my image transfer. And really what that is adding and removing paint in certain areas. So it's pretty straightforward. Adding paint, you're just taking some of the acrylic paint that you were using instead of with your brayer, using your paintbrush and applying it in to achieve more contrast in areas or darken certain areas a little bit more, maybe find the structure that might have been lost in the image transfer process. Now, likewise, you can remove acrylic paint. You could do this by using a little bit of water on your brush, but sometimes if it's dried too much, you need to use baby oil. And you can just use a little bit of baby oil. You can use a cotton swab like a Q-tip as well, and try to remove areas of color of the black acrylic paint. It's too monotone. It doesn't have the right amount of contrast. So I usually work hand in hand with a piece of cloth and a Q-tip. Over here I am using mineral oil, baby oil, to help kind of get off some of the more dried on paint. It's not as like super easy to do, but it certainly works for those blemishes or areas that you want to work on a little bit more. Make sure you blot up all of the excess baby oil because it will make your other paint pool when you go to add it on top. Now I begin the process that you may have seen me do in just about every one of my videos, where I do reverse painting, starting with the details and then building up layer upon layer. As I work on these, they need to dry in between. Then you would need to do your transfer layer. And I apologize, but my phone ran out of storage and I did not get the video of my transfer layer. But basically, I applied a coat of paint over the entire back end of that gel plate and laid a piece of Bristol on top and let it dry overnight. Because there were so many layers, I wanted to make sure it was fully dry. Now I wanted to go in at this point and work on it even more. Since it wasn't the best image transfer, it lacked a little bit of clarity, but with some extra painting, I think it all came out together quite well. And here is the final painting, monotype, whatever. At this point, who knows what it is. So here's another image that I'm going to demonstrate. It is a laser printed image, and I must be honest, I tried to print this one several times and it just was not transferring. I wasn't sure if I had too little paint on the gel plate or if the image wasn't edited properly enough and it was coming out really inconsistent every time I transferred it. So this time you could see I am trying to be very thoughtful about how I roll out the paint and try to make sure it's relatively thin but even throughout. I really think this is the third time I'm printing it out. It's on A3 printer paper, probably about 100-gram printer paper, and I am gently pressing down the image to make sure that it has contact with all parts of the gel plate and the acrylic paint. And then I pull it up to see if it's transferring. And at this point, I'm nervously pulling it out and seeing, okay, I think it's working. Now, when you see this, it may look a little grungy, and that's mainly because the opposite side of my gel plate is covered with leftover residue from other prints that I've done. So some of those splotchy black marks are actually from previous prints on the underside. Since I'm working on a larger plate than my actual image size, I am playing around with that border to see if I can incorporate it in an interesting way. Now, I don't want this lot of black around the edge, so I'm using scrap paper just to push down while the paint is wet. This has to be while the black paint is wet, to lift up and get some of it off. I want that sort of textural quality. If you have seen like double exposures or like Polaroids with the bleed edge, you know, back in the day when I used to take photos and use a dark room, you would have the frame that would go around the paper and you could let some light bleed underneath that to get some really cool edges. So I'm trying to play around with a similar type of look, not directly, but an idea of that to get some variation around the border and play with the fact that my copier will only go up to A3, and sure, I can collage together bigger images, but what can I do with just an A3 on a larger plate? Once it's completely dry, I can go in and start adding the smaller details. I tend to work on the things that I want to be as pronounced as possible first. So I'll pick out smaller details, lettering, highlights, and I tend to work by one color and kind of work around my plate to see where else I can add that color. This helps create a sense of unity on the whole plate. Now, I did not add any gel medium or anything else on top of this, so you can see my paint starts to pool. And sometimes I like to lean into that, and sometimes I don't. It depends on my mood at the time. For this one, I want to play into the textural quality of the pooling. So I'm just continuing to add details, kind of working color by color right now, And as I start to evolve, I don't do this so much like one color one here and work around. I start building in a variety of colors and using my palette a lot more. The paints that I'm using are a variety of different brands. They are being mixed on a palette on the side. I tend to use a disposable palette or a piece of wax paper to mix my paints. I try not to work directly with paint straight from the tube as I want that color variation. I want to experiment with how colors can interact. And I find that if I am mixing the colors and I have control, I can play around with how those colors will relate to one another. By mixing certain colors together, I can create a different feeling. So at this point, I have most of the details on and I'm going in to fill in larger areas. And I can be a little sloppier with this, but I still want to keep my layers fairly smooth. You can see I even put a dab of paint on my plate and I'm working with those thicker parts and just kind of smoothing it out as I move around the plate. So the thing that I did very differently with this one is I had a print that I did that was not a very good print. I did an image transfer with one of my other photos and it didn't come out that great and I just kind of threw it on and peeled it off on a scrap piece of Bristol. And I decided I was going to print this one on top of it. Why? Well, I've kind of figured why not. I do my transfer layer. I'm doing it in a combination of this bright color and some white because I kind of want some of that little bits of bright to influence the colors that will be on top of it once I do the image transfer. For the transfer layer, you have to make sure you have a good balance of paint. It doesn't have to be overly thick, but you want to make sure that you have enough that it coats the entire plate and stays wet before you apply the Bristol. So I'm adding another layer of paint because I also want to go over the sides. I haven't done any of the border of this, and I want that to be more of this blue with a little bit of the yellow in, which these two colors just remind me so much of Naples, and that's where the photo is from. It's from Napoli in Centro Storico, and the color of the houses tend to be this yellow ochre, and of course the color of Napoli is this azzurro, this like turquoise color that you see on all the flags, and obviously the couch of the football, the soccer. And so here's my image, and I'm laying it down flat on the wet paint, and I push down, trying to get all of the edges just perfectly attached, making sure that there's contact on all sides. I'm using a Baron, which helps burnish the paper onto the plate. It's not necessary to use this, but I have one, so I use it. And it helps really get the contact even throughout. I'm not pressing overly hard, but it's a firm pressure. It's the next day, and I am ready to peel up my plate. I start peeling it back and I want to assess, is it all transferring? Is it all being picked up off of the gel plate? And for the most part, it is. I can see there's some areas that there was some residue left on the plate. Sometimes when it doesn't pull off perfectly, I may try to go at it from a different angle, and that helps a lot. So I have this one part that tore completely, and that's not really a problem. I'm just going to take some gel medium and a brush and go over both the part that's on the gel plate and the part that's on the paper, and I'll lay it back down and let it dry. I weighted it down with some books and I let it dry. Now that it's dry, I can pull it up and you can see that it is no longer stuck in that area. It all attaches much better to the paper, and I have a pretty decent pull. At this point, I'm pretty happy with the print. You can't see the other print underneath, which helps me upcycle some used prints, but I'm sure some of that color underneath influenced the colors that are on top. I'm going back in with a small paintbrush to, up the contrast a little bit, pull out some details that may have gotten lost in the process. This particular photo that I used had a lot of detail from shoes that are hanging on a line across the street, and all of the balconies and awnings and details and wires and stuff like that. Things that are a little hard to always get to transfer with the image transfer, even if it's a super high contrast, high resolution photo. So I want to go back and pull out the areas I want a little bit more focus on. I think the most important thing about any artwork, other than the meaning or content, would have to be the composition. If the composition is interesting, people will look at it longer, and I think that's really, you want that time for people to look at your work to kind of understand it better. Having angled lines or leading lines into your composition is a great way to do that. At this point, I'm really focused on the composition. I want to make sure that the angled lines of the wires and the buildings all meet together in a composition that is interesting. And sometimes I have to influence with the colors that I choose. Pull out some highlights in areas and let some others kind of recede back. Then it's a matter of looking at the work, and when you feel like it all ties together, you can say that you are done. And I think I am done with this one. Now, a lot of you are struggling with the image transfer part itself and trying to get that perfectly done. And I'm here to tell you that it is a struggle. So even though a lot of times I will have good, clean image transfers and I have a system in place to help ensure that it works out, it doesn't always work. Like I explained in my previous one with the shoes on the wires and Naples, sometimes I have to try again and again. So I thought I would show you in real time how sometimes it doesn't work and what I would adjust. So right now I feel fairly confident that I have the right amount of paint on my plate. My photo is edited the way the other photos have been. I'm using a high resolution photo. It is CMYK, so meaning it's printing out in color even though it's a black and white photo. I have it done in halftone, but it's a really, really dense halftone. And I think that might have been my problem. And so I try to pull it up, and even though you saw how gentle I am touching, it is not, it's not working. I'm getting frustrated here. I pull it up, and then in a fit of, oh well, I just pull the whole thing up. It's just not working. I lost all the detail. It was all sucked up into my laser printout, and I'm left with something that doesn't resemble my photo. So at this point, I'm going to see if I could salvage something. So I take a piece of paper, and while the acrylic paint is wet, I press it down. This will serve two purposes. One, it will help me clean my plate a little quicker. It will just help me get it all off the plate. But maybe, just maybe, whatever I pull up from here will be a good pull or an interesting pull, something that I can use in another artwork. And when I pull it out, I see it's okay. I could go in and, draw on it, but most likely that's just going to be another scrap piece of paper. I think this one will be really interesting for you to see because I will show you through some of my trials and tribulations and focus on how I moved forward through them to create one of my probably favorite image transfers. I'm laying out my acrylic paint just like I have on the others, and working from pretty much the center out toward the edge and then trying to lay my image on top of it. So do you remember the photo of the shoes on the wire from Naples that I did earlier in this video? I actually have that photo here from a failed attempt, and I put it down, and because you can reprint your laser prints several times, I'm trying to do it again because I am determined to make this one work. And so I am rolling over with the brayer. I think sometimes when you are using it a second time, the brayer is helpful. And you can see I have a mess. Not enough paint soaked up into the paper. You can kind of see a bit of an image of it, but it's not really there. So I am being impatient. Instead of cleaning up the paint first, I am just going to roll out more paint and see if I can do another image transfer on top of it. This is not the way to do it because that paint dries so quickly on the gel plate that it can ruin your next image transfer. So don't necessarily do as I am doing. But if you do find yourself in this situation, this is how I got around it. I'm using a different photo that I took. It is super, super high contrast. I place it on. I'm using the brayer to go over the back of it. I figure with this much paint, I probably need the extra pressure of the brayer, and I peel it back. Nothing's going on. At this point, I'm so frustrated. All I wanted to do was to create some art, and nothing is working. I go very heavily handedly with the brayer. I am just pushing on this, determined to have something come out and checking it all the time. And go back and press and go back and press. And I see it's sort of working. It is not what I would consider a good transfer. And this is what I do. I just go over it to get as much of it transferred as possible, and then I peel it off. At this point, because I went back and forth and back and forth and laid it back down, my image transfer is not very clear. In fact, it is blurry from probably the photo being placed on and off, and not quite aligning perfectly. Or maybe it's from the pressure with the brayer. I'm not sure. It is just not what I want. But I decide, you know what? I'm making art today. I am leaning into this. I am going to make this work. I clean up my edges a little bit. Before I start my reverse painting, I coat the whole plate with a little bit of gel medium. And that's what I do right now. But I apply the gel medium while the black is still a tiny bit wet. So it makes it even more blurry. And then I'm going to go in and paint while the gel medium is still wet. Just lean into it. This is my daughter who's helping me out. She's laying down the layer, and I always like to have one of my two assistants helping me in the process. So now I'm adding the paint. I am going directly into the wet gel medium. It won't stay wet for that long, but enough that everything that I'm going to be putting down is going to be just a little bit more sloppy and fluid and blend together. And I'm just leaning into my mistakes. Now, if you've seen a lot of my other videos, I tend to focus on the small details first, but in this one, I focused on the sky, mainly because I wanted that really kind of fluid, mushy feeling in the sky. So I'm not focusing on small details here. It's a little bit more bigger, patchier areas because I'm not going to have a lot of small details. So I just blocked in some main things, and then I am just going for it. I am taking some paint and just placing it down in some areas and then going over with the brayer. So maybe this sort of, I don't know what color you would even call this. Seafoam green is not the paint color, but it's kind of like a very light phthalo green will pop through some of the background. So some areas it's a little thicker and some areas it's a little bit thinner, and I hope it will help translate this fluid quality. At this point, I know from the start of the image transfer that it's like not going to be what I want it to be. So I have the chance to embrace that and just experiment. I did not, you're watching this almost in real time. Some parts are sped up and a few clips are cut out, but all of this is still wet. All of my layers underneath are still wet when I'm adding this transfer layer, this buff titanium on top. I am just going for it and seeing what I can do. The moral of the story is, if you've already screwed everything up, why not try to push it to the limit and see what more you can screw up? Because you never know, it might turn into, like Bob Ross says, a happy accident. And I think in this case, I was really happy I did it. I'm going to speed it up now so you can get through this part. It's a little boring. I let this dry at least overnight, and then I am peeling it back. I am trying to be very conscious that it still might be wet in some areas, and I'm not 100% sure it will fully peel off of the plate. So here I go, and I can see that it is sticking in some areas, and I wonder, do I put it back down or do I just touch up that area? And I'm going for it, because why not? Sometimes I roll the plate off of the print, or sometimes I pull the print off of the plate, and that all depends on what surface I'm working on. Sometimes I have it on a piece of acetate, which is easy to remove, and sometimes I have it on a piece of plexiglass underneath the plate when I'm working. And if it's on the plexiglass, I have to pull the paper off of the gel plate and not the other way around, because the plexiglass gets super, super sticky, and not really sticky, but it's attached. I didn't do that much overpainting on this. I just touched up that tear area, and this is the final piece, and I am happy I embraced the mistakes and just went for it. And I'm not sure if I like the rough edges on this. I'm pretty sure I do. This is what it looks like all closed in without those rough edges. So let me know which one you prefer. Of course, sometimes you cannot rescue a print. You can try, and the print may not turn out as well. This is one that I'm doing of Pink Street in Lisbon on my 16 by 20 plate like the rest. And I thought it was starting off quite well. I have hinged together all of the different parts of my photo together with tape, and I didn't want to have too many lines, so it was kind of falling apart a little bit. That was my first issue. But my photo was edited well, and I thought it was going to transfer well. However, when I lifted it up, I was not overly impressed. So much of the acrylic paint was just soaked up into the paper, and it was not left onto the plate. The image still was there, and I thought I could work around with it, but I didn't want to spend a ton of time. So I did just some color. It's Pink Street. I thought I would throw on some bright pink, and maybe it would pop. And despite me trying to vary the pink a little bit and try to pull out the definition of the umbrellas that hang above Pink Street in Lisbon, it just did not work. It turned into just a bad scene. After letting it dry under books, I pulled it off, and this is what I got. So I hope through this video you get to see how I troubleshoot and problem solve some of the big issues that I have with my image transfers. Granted, this is at a stage where they're actually transferring. If you're still struggling with the actual transfer process, check out my videos on how to edit photos and print photos so they have a better chance of transferring to begin with. But once you get them to transfer, sometimes that situation does not work out perfectly. So hopefully this video has taught you some tips and tricks on how to problem solve when you get so close to having a good printout. You can either rework your image transfer through additive and subtractive methods. You can paint on top of your monotype to help bring out details. You can repurpose old monotypes. You can try and try again. changing the amount of paint and how you edit your photo to get better results. And remember, for any of the supplies you need, I do have my personalized recommendations linked on my Amazon storefront. I do receive an itty-bitty commission from anything that's purchased on there, which helps me continue to do the things that I do and make tutorials like this. So, I hope you enjoy looking at my process and understanding it. If you're interested in any of my works, just send me a message or go to my website. I have links to sales on there. And let me know in the comments what else you want to learn. I'd be happy to make a video dealing with a certain aspect of this process. So I wish you all the best of luck. Check out my description down below for some more tips and resources, and happy printing.